Welcome to the Exhaust Notes podcast.
What is good, everyone? Welcome to the Exhaust Notes Formula One, maybe some other motorsports podcast, your new favorite Formula One podcast, your favorite podcaster's favorite Formula One podcast. We got all sorts of little nicknames and things for this show. But if you listen to the last couple episodes, you know we've been doing some things differently. We started a Substack over at exhaustnotes.substack.com. We're doing some writing in between these episodes. We're trying to build a little bit more of a holistic, let's say, experience for all these people that follow us, listen to us, and want to talk some trash about racing. But today, I have got a guest on with me. I know we don't normally do guests on this show, but this man is... He's a diehard Formula One motorsports fan. He's kind of, this might sound weird, but Blake is kind of he's like the me in the watch world. He's like one of the most respected behind the scenes guys, has his own podcast, The Deep Track, talks about the watch world, does a lot of cool events, and he talks about Formula One occasionally on his podcast. But I thought, hey, we've known each other a long time. We've talked about talking about cars for a good almost 10 years now, and we have never done it. So today's the day. Blake Buettner is on the show with me. Welcome to the show, Blake. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Nick. Thank you so much for having me. You know this is going to be a good idea when you and I just end up talking with no cameras, no microphones. We somehow end up talking about cars and racing for a while anyway, so it feels like a very organic thing. Totally.
For a little context for the listeners and the viewers, you know, we talk about Formula One on this episode or on this show specifically with Todd and Rowett, but Todd and I are big fans of motorsport outside of Formula One too. I knew you were a fan of motorsports outside of Formula One, and you know, you texted me the other day, said, "Well, would we talk about just Formula One, or is there going to be some other stuff in there?" And I thought, well, let's just see where it goes, because right now is like the perfect time to open up those conversations for the people that don't know other forms of racing. Because it just came out within the last week or two that Max, with the cancellations of the Formula One races, Max is going to race in Le Mans, right?
At the Nürburgring.
Nürburgring, that's what it is.
24 hours of the Nürburgring, and I think they just revealed the GTE, I think they call it now. Class car that he's doing with Mercedes.
Yeah, super cool. And so maybe we'll get into that. Maybe that'll be another episode. We'll see. We've got a little bit of time before that actually happens, but... For the listeners, Blake, give a little bit of background on your journey in, I guess, let's start with your personal journey to give a little background on you, and then we'll get into maybe the connection between watches and Formula One, because I have some questions about some of the shifts that have happened over the past few years, let's say.
Yeah, it's been crazy. And obviously the sport of F1 has had its own kind of like trajectory change in recent years. But stepping back, I have been in and around the watch industry for 15, 20 years, covering it editorially for a long time. You know, our overlap at StockX, I think, was the only time that I've been outside of kind of like pure editorial type stuff, because it was a marketplace, I guess, which was a little outside of my wheelhouse. But it was great. So I was an early editor with Hodinkee and helped build that site up for its first 5-6 years. So I was managing editor of a website called Worn and Wound here in New York. And now I have my own publication called The Deep Track. So I write about watches every day. I review watches, interview people from the industry, and have a podcast, of course, where I get to talk about watches and explore the people. You know, there's only so many things that you can kind of like really nerd out about with watches technically. And then I think beyond that, and I'm sure it's the same in sneakers and racing, it's really the kind of people there in the community and the enthusiast spaces that make it interesting and compelling enough for you to want to like hang around for the long term. So I love exploring my other interests, because at the end of the day, there are a lot more overlaps, I think, than people realize within these enthusiast spaces, as niche as they may be. And I really enjoy kind of like exploring those intersections.
Yeah, totally. And it's funny because we talked about that the last time I was on your show, and I didn't connect some of the dots, even being pretty, let's say, deep into these things. I didn't connect some of the intersections. And you talked about, you know, the recent event that you had in San Francisco and who showed up there, and some of the people from the car world that are, you know, not like Formula One people, but like the normal car enthusiasts, I would say, like, you know, that sounds maybe bad or wrong, but like the relatable car people, I guess, is the best way to put it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. If you got like your meetups on the weekends or once a month that you go to a Cars and Coffee, or even got like more specific, like your guys that just have the kind of like 90s Japanese cars that go and do runs through the hills, or the American muscle car, whatever it is, right? There's all these little groups there. And the guy that runs Radwood is really into this. I mean, really like, high character cars, right?
Yeah.
Not just kind of like my status, here's my $300,000 supercar or whatever. Like it's no, I'm really into this on this level, and you find other people that have that same psychosis.
Yeah, totally. High character. I love that. That's actually the perfect way to put it, because when I see something even on the road that is like high character, even if it's like there's a couple of old Toyota sedan. There's like a 78 Toyota wagon, and it's like an 82. I think it's like a Cressida. Like it's one of the the first big Toyotas that we didn't get in the States, but it's lowered a little bit. It's got some old race wheels on it.
Nice.
Like when I see those cars, like that is it, right? It's like, that person cares so much about like a very niche thing that you're like, I just want to go learn from that person. Like, I just want to, let's have some coffee and like, tell me about how this became your thing,
Yeah, you see certain cars and you're like, okay, that's not, you don't just stumble into that car, just randomly buy that car,
Yeah,
right? And it's the
yeah.
same with the certain watches. It's the same with certain sneakers, I'm sure. Like you see a certain pair that a person's rocking, that person probably knows a bit about sneakers. So he's into it a little bit, or she's into it a little bit, more than just your average consumer.
Yep, definitely. So how did you get into cars, into racing? Like, was that a byproduct of the watch interest, or was that something that started before the watch interest?
It honestly, it started before. Since I was
Okay.
a real young kid, I've always been into this stuff. And I when I was early, maybe 12 and 13, I lived in Japan with my family for a bit, and that really kind of like, and this was around the era. It would have been the early and mid 90s.
Yep.
Absolute heyday of like awesome cars coming out, so I was exposed to that kind of culture, from a young age. So it just kind of like instantly seeped into like who I was. And then when it came back, it's just something, I'd always have the magazines that you'd be looking at on the racks and that kind of stuff. And then it took a little while to get into the kind of the European like sports car type stuff. But, it was always kind of the old, MR2s, Preludes, whatever, like Integras. I loved that kind of stuff more than anything, because the culture of like customization and expression of these cars was kind of like really becoming, I guess, something more that I would notice back at that stage. And that really helps get me to like sink my teeth in like, wow, look at what people are doing with these things. How cool is that?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Fast and Furious stuff kind of like lit a match and really kind of like under all that stuff. And then it became its own thing, which is fine and great. But that's been a thing since before, those movies came out. And
Totally.
I've always been kind of like fascinated by those elements of it because of the time that I spent in Japan and just how much it got under my skin there.
Yeah, I same thing for me. So my family, not the living in Japan part, that I'm totally jealous of, but my family was driving Honda Civics. My dad and my mom both ended up with Honda Civics, even post divorce. And I have an uncle that worked at a Chevy dealership in Sacramento for a really long time, like kind of just known as the guy at the Chevy dealership for a lot of Sacramento people. And my cousin worked there early on before he kind of moved on to other things, but he bought a 91 Civic SI, the Tahitian green teal color, perfect car, and bought it new. And that was like, there was so much wow factor in that for me. I was just like, whoa. Like, and then he had, at the time, 16-inch wheels on it, which people thought he was crazy because it was 16s and 15s were standard back then. I think the car came with 13s. Maybe the SI came with 14s, but it was just like, oh, this is aggressive step up kind of thing. And it was before the trend of all of those Honda things. So like we were into that stuff pretty heavily. And I remember trying to, early message boards and AOL chat, trying to find somebody that can get me parts, and you're sending money to somebody that you have no idea if you're going to actually get something, but like you have the, oh, I wrote this check to this guy who says he can get me this thing. And then, 8 months later, you're like, I have this thing that no one else has, one piece headlights for an Integra for me. If anybody knows, was like, my experience with that was just changed everything about it. And then of course, like you said, with Fast and Furious, it made everybody pay attention to that stuff way more. And like, obviously it's a different style choice for a lot of that stuff, but there's a lot of crossover there. There's a lot of kind of intermixed, choices between it. And, I do the Cars and Kicks show with my buddies Eric and Jacques. And on that show, we had RJ De Vera on to talk about the Fast and Furious. So for those that don't know, he was a consultant on the film. He comes from street racing, Southern California street racing. And back then in the, mid to late 90s, you had like 3 or 4 different hot spots that you would go street racing at. I never really street raced, but, I ended up there occasionally just as a viewer because I had friends that were, had something to prove, let's say. And he talked about the kind of consulting aspect with that film in the late 90s. It came out in 2001, but the first one they were filming for, good 2 years before that. He talked about how much of a struggle it was to get people to keep the authenticity in the culture. There's moments in that we make fun of and lovingly kind of adore at this point as fans, but it was a really cool conversation. And I always think about that in regards to what we do, because he's the guy in the stereotypical Asian kid playing video games in his Integra in the movie, which, there's a lot of like negative about that. And then when you look at it too, like he was already doing a lot of stuff, but it popped off his career to a point where he's doing a lot of amazing things. I think he's heading up marketing at SEMA now. But I think about like the conversations you and I have had, and even when I had that conversation with him, I was thinking about some of the stuff we talk about where we're trying to connect this, this very like passionate group of people that have so much care and so much attention to detail to something that is applied and, built for the masses. And that's always an interesting challenge, but it's also kind of where you and I land in the same storytelling, understanding, and community connection of all the things that we love, it seems like.
Yeah, it really is, and it's like a personal thing too, and I think that's what those movies really kind of brought out. It's not like you needed some exotic, crazy car to be into the space. You could have, I had a '91 Toyota Celica, and which I love, and it was, and nothing fancy or anything, but I would, if there's anywhere or anyone making custom parts for it, of any sort, I was like, oh, what can I do? Like, what are my options? And I think it was the same for a lot of people. And then people get into it for different, it's not like, all the emphasis in the movie on like having a 10-second car and the racing part, like that was certainly part of it, like having, the high horsepower, all that kind of stuff. But it was so much else as well. Like, visually, like aesthetically, what the car would look like. And I think it gave people different avenues to express themselves in the hobby that wasn't just, I've got an expensive car, I've got a super fast car. There was all these other things in between that I think made it interesting for people who weren't going to, have a super expensive car. Or if I had a car with like over 200 horsepower, that was like, whoa, that was like a big deal back then. And it's not like I cared so much about like drag strip stuff. I cared about like, well, would it like be fun to handle in like twisty roads, in my front wheel drive Celica. So then it evolved to like, well, it's a rear wheel drive car that I could maybe find, and the whole journey that goes through that. But I think it really kind of offered us like kind of a way to like personalize our experience in this space, which I think is a great thing, without us all having to kind of like align to, these are the cars, this is the way it's got to be, and this is, and that, I think there was a real kind of beauty of it really kind of exploding in the way that it did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too that a lot of times we forget, even whether we're the type of people that are creating the content and living in it on a daily basis, or, the friends that we have that are really passionate about these things. I think a lot of us forget that, there's like a stepping stone, a gateway drug to becoming a real enthusiast. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that like when you're, when I was 15, 16, I was buying. So I bought my first car when I was at my 13th birthday. It was an 81 Prelude. It didn't run, but I was like, I want to figure it out. And my stepdad, like the guy that was selling it, basically was like, well, I just need to get rid of it. So he was asking $150, but I didn't have a way to tow it. So he towed it to the house. I said, I'll buy it for $75, and gave him $75 to tow it to the house. Never got it running, never. It was just like a learning experience, like, but I had been like really focused on getting a car. There's probably some therapy that I need to have in there to talk about that whole desire to get out, but get away from home and all that stuff. But you start to find your independence in it. And I think that was such a driving factor for me. But like, when I step back and think about it, it's like, yeah, I might have bought Cerwin Vega speakers before I had a running car, but I also bought like, the cheesy neon shift knob because it was the only thing that was at AutoZone or Pep Boys or whatever. And I think what happens in these kind of enthusiast areas of life where people are so diehard about it, we forget that like that person that, buys the, cheapest knockoff or the cheapest brand of watch or, puts a crazy, ridiculous spoiler on their bone stock, Civic. Those are the people that just haven't been exposed to the things that we really love about these things. Because once you start to understand it, you start to refine your taste. You start to understand, like you said about the Celica, it's like you could have had a New Speed or a Gab Sports or some, brand strut bar or sticker on the car. 2% of the people in the car world are even going to know what those are at the time. But those 2% of the people all of a sudden become close friends. You start to build the network. You start to really say, I know that I can look for other things now because it's not always easy to find it. And I think because of the internet, we've kind of dismissed that people should be able to find what the real authentic, kind of cool, I don't know, like passionate enthusiast people find. But it's not that easy to find your way through. You still got to get out of the algorithm. You still got to like really push yourself out of it. And most people don't think about that. They just think, I just want my Civic to look a little bit cooler, so I'm going to get this giant spoiler or I'm going to get big wheels or whatever. So there's like this arc of people becoming aware of the good that can happen and the bad that they've already done.
Yeah, it's honestly, I'm glad that like Instagram, stuff like that wasn't a thing back then because we could kind of like make our decisions and stumble on our own and kind of like refine our own tastes in our own way. I think if there was kind of like, these are the cars that get the most likes and I'm motivated by having people like the pictures of my car, so like it would have changed it a bit. And I think that's probably the same for all hobbies. It kind of like everyone kind of just becomes this like homogenous group of like, well, these are the hype watches, these are the hype sneakers, these are the hype cars, and this is what people do to the car, and then it's like everyone kind of like aligns with this because that's what's popular online instead of doing it for your own, like finding your own reasons. And we can look back now and like laugh at the stupid stuff that we had on our cars. And we did, but that was like all like part of the fun of it. And like no one was there to like say, that looks ridiculous and you guys look stupid. I'm sure we totally did. I remember buying the little valve stems for your wheels that would like light up when you went over a certain speed. But that's the kind of thing that is like, you realize like, oh, I can do something, customize this and make it my own. And that mattered more than what other people think this is going to look like. It's going to be cool. It was just, no, this is me like expressing myself in whatever weird, stupid way. You're 17 and, you'd look at the magazines and I'd always dream of getting like a front clip from like a 3S GTE engine from the all-track turbo and put, all the pie in the sky stuff and or all the engine stuff from Japan, which of course we could never even come close to affording or finding. I wouldn't even know how to go about getting something like that. But that was part of the culture that you like really, I don't know, it was so much fun. It was like fun in a different way because I wasn't influenced by like, well, what do other people think of this? And are people liking this on Instagram? It wasn't about that, Yeah,
totally. Well, and that's, I think, I think of you a lot in that way with watches, right? Like a lot of times when I'm listening to the show or even reading the blog, you're kind of like, yes, you're going to talk about like all of watches because, like if there's a new out of this world priced watch that, is unrelatable to most people, then it may be aspirational, but it's important to talk about it in the context of like, you can also just, hunt down an old watch. Like you had a story on one of the recent episodes that I listened to about like one of the watches that you kind of just, it's not necessarily I forget the name of it, but you basically like, it's not necessarily like a popular watch, but for you, it was one of those watches that you had back in the day. And it's like, you go back and find that. And I think that aspect of all of this is very relatable. And it's such an interesting thing because, you know, I look at Formula One, to shift kind of towards that now. I look at Formula One and I see the intention of the watches every moment of time. You know, like there is not there are very few seconds in the Formula One broadcast where a person is talking on camera and the watch is not intentionally shown.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a cool thing about what your corner of the world versus the sneaker world. Because Formula One, you know, I just wrote a piece on the newsletter, the sneaker newsletter, about all these shoes that I've collected over the years. So I've been collecting Formula One shoes since probably 90. I think I graduated in 97. So like my first pairs were like 96, 97. That's when like the Schumacher Nike deal was on, and I got a pair of those. Still have like the original pair up on the wall behind me here. You know, over the years I went back and found other things. So I've got like Williams shoes from, you know, 91 and 96, where like they've got the molded outsole of a Formula One car in the outsole, you know, and like there was serious effort put into these things, but they never get the screen time that watches get. So like there's a huge disconnect between the passionate sneakerheads and racing that I think you get the real benefit of being in the watch stuff. Like there's a direct connection there. The sponsors are there and all that. So talk about that a little bit and like how you look at that as a fan of racing.
Well, I mean, you just said it there, like the sponsors, and now it's like, you know, it's the thing to be into. And, you know, it's not a cheap sport to be into, I don't think, for anyone. So it's not like for everyone. Where maybe back in the day there could be some smaller brands that could be into it. You know, now that's long gone. And, you know, now you've got like big, you know, blue chip style brands that are part of these things. And I think for them, it's kind of like, well, how do we take advantage of this? And I think there's still a lot of brands are still kind of figuring that out, how they can best do that. You know, one of the long-term ones, IWC, has been a partner of Mercedes for a long time, and I think that has evolved and resulted in some neat watches. And you see, you know, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell wearing the watches, all that kind of stuff, and it's cool. But you always know that it's part of the sponsorship thing. And from my perspective, I'm always more interested in when I catch a glimpse of like going into the season, Bortoletto and not Magnussen, the other Audi driver,
Hulkenberg.
Oh, yeah, his old teammate. Like they were sitting doing like getting to know each other, whatever, kind of to preview the season, and seeing what they were wearing. They didn't have watch sponsors. There's no watch sponsor for the team. So seeing them, you know, he had like an AP on or something you would expect, like a rich guy watch, right? So to me, I find like that kind of stuff kind of interesting. Or when Lewis Hamilton is spotted wearing like a Patek or something different that he has no association with, like that I find interesting. If it shows a level of, oh, they must have thought about that or put some thought into it, or maybe they're into that. Because I think, you know, just like with a lot of other things, like I said, you know, if somebody just like bought that because they had the money and that's what rich people buy, or if they put some thought into like, oh, that's kind of like a nerdy watch. And if you see somebody wearing one of those, then, you know, maybe they're into it on another level. And that's trickier to suss out because they're so well controlled, right, by the sponsors. And I'll give kind of a funny example. Last year, maybe it was 2 years ago now, when Alpine in Brazil in the rain had a shock 2-3 finish with Ocon and Gasly. I guess it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago, I think.
Now that I think about it, obviously, like totally unexpected, and you know, Max had his typical like charge up through the field and won. But the two Alpine drivers managed to hold on and get onto the podium, something that had not happened that entire season and has not happened since. And you know, maybe we'll get into that. But they have a brand called Moser and C that sponsors Alpine as a racing apparatus, and you know they make watches for the drivers, for the mechanics. They even make a digital watch for the mechanics to keep track of certain things. It's pretty cool. But anyways, no one was expecting the drivers to be on the podium, and nobody came and like gave them their watches to put on. So here they're doing all these post-race interviews, doing all this super high profile stuff, and they did not have their watches on the whole time. And they're a small brand, so I kind of felt bad. And of course, people in my position, I noticed immediately they're not wearing their watches. It's two brothers that run the brand, the Malin brothers, and I talked to them afterwards about it, and they kind of laugh it off a little bit. But you can tell there was a lot of like tension in that moment, because it's like, oh, what do we do for a team like that to be thrust into that situation just like immediately? I don't think that'll happen again, but where they will forget their watches, that is. But now it's so tightly controlled. Like the first thing you see when they get out of the car and they go put the helmet on the little stand, and somebody walks up, puts the watch right there, and a towel, and that's like it. So it's like a part of their process now. The Richard Meals, the IWC, the whatever it is, they're all right there, and they're all a part of it. So there's a little bit of artificiality to it, but if you like watches, it's fun to see what they're wearing, I suppose.
Totally. And it's like the NBA and the tunnel walks, or the WNBA and the tunnel walks, like you just, that it's 100% intentional, but it's still interesting to see the choices, and like you said, when those choices are not a part of, not to say that people need to go wear a different brand than their sponsor or something, but when you see something that makes you think, oh, there's care behind that, there's an intention behind that, it's really like what makes you want to follow an athlete more or a celebrity more, in my opinion. This sounds bad, but like there are very few athletes that I am a fan of them because of the sport that they compete in. Like I'm drawn to the human element and the core values of the people, even when I I want to see them win, but it's the things that when you dig deeper into somebody that I start to like, oh man, that's, like the fact that, I don't know, easy example is Sebastian Vettel doing all of his stuff with, trying to make the world a better place. And like that intention is like so admirable, especially because he has, tens of millions of dollars and could do anything that he wants with his life at this point. And that's what he chooses to do. So those types of things, like, and standing up for what they believe in, it's like we've gotten to the point where so much of this stuff is buried intentionally and people aren't given the chance to share their voice on things. I think that still is like the core draw for me, which is always interesting that it starts with like the littlest of things. It could start with, seeing the choice that they make on watches, seeing the choice that they make on sneakers, the fact that, somebody has a dog is appealing to me.
Of course,
don't matter about racing at all, but like, when you start to understand, oh, they like there's a line in Ted Lasso that one of the guys says, footballers, they're just like us. They're like, it's like, yeah, they like, we're all humans, but we think of people differently because of what we watch them do, obviously.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to think about too. And one of the things that I was thinking about talking about recently was just this. I wrote about this a little bit when I was talking about the sneakers on the newsletter, but Cadillac launched and wore Panda Dunks. Shoes 2-3 years old now, kind of in the sneaker world is super tired, played out. Everybody's kind of moved on well past it. And there's so much of Formula One media that doesn't understand the sneaker world because it's not a part of it, and I would imagine that's kind of something that you could talk about with watches, because to have the guys walk out in matching shoes is great. To have them have shoes that match their uniforms is great. But it's crazy how much the Formula One world took that and said, Cadillac is going to partner with Nike. And I'm not saying that that's not a possibility. We've talked a little bit about that on the Sneaker History podcast, but like it is so backwards to think that Nike would allow Cadillac to wear a shoe from 2 or 3 years ago, even if it's the perfect trendy, everyone recognizes it shoe. Like the calculation that you talk about in the watches and like everything being, programmatic and like how we display this, how we get this on camera. And like, there are days where I'm like, this is too forced. And then there are days it's like, oh, what is he wearing? I kind of live on this like edge of loving and hating it. Yeah. But it's an interesting part of Formula One conversation this season that's never really existed there. I see all of that stuff because, Puma had events at Miami and did a bunch of special merch. Like there's been very race focused, opportunities where Puma brings back the Speed Cat. It's everywhere. Like there's brand partnerships across the paddock with all of these teams of some sort. But K-Swiss did some stuff with McLaren the last couple of years they had a 2-year contract. But like nobody in the Formula One world did anything more than take that press release and regurgitate it for their audience. So it didn't land on anything. And yet the first time you see something that is, let's say, more recognizable and connected to this new team, everybody connects the dots and tries to make a story about it. And it's almost like, I wonder if people at Nike probably think about it differently now. Like there's probably more conversation of like, should we do this after the fact than there was beforehand? And I wonder if that happens in the watch space at all for these teams or drivers that, like you said, with Alpine, not even having, kind of anything planned out for that one moment, where guys like you and I, we're thinking about that moment because so much of editorial and storytelling is defined by those moments where somebody said, yes, we did it. This is what happened. We're excited to share it. Oh, by the way, he was wearing this at that moment, and we're going to celebrate that 5-10 years from now with a new version or whatever that is.
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of the brands that are involved will maybe release like 1, maybe 2 watches a year for something explicit, like around the team. A few years back, I think it was maybe the first race in Miami, which was maybe 4 or 5 years now, 3 or 4 years. And IWC came out with this like titanium pilot with the Petronas green details on the dial and like a cool Petronas green rubber strap, which is their like fuel partner, which is kind of a strange thing, I think. But they incorporated the colors from the livery into the watch, and it was pretty cool. And I've been, I think, every season since, I've been to a race with IWC and Mercedes, and I've been in the garage, and I see them. The mechanics still wear this watch, even like seasons later, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And if I get a chance to talk to them every now and then, you get to say something, and they love them, and they've got their old watches, like they actually wear them. And again, that speaks to like, these, maybe they're not like the high profile people, but they're like a part of the team, and they're still wearing these things like with a lot of pride. And I think that's pretty cool. And these are watches, right? It's a different thing than like a shoe, which I think of as more like seasonal in nature, kind of, right? Where a watch, like watch brand is asking you to drop, $10,000 for something that you're going to have for the rest of your life. So I think it makes sense to see it maybe beat up in the garage a few years later on the same mechanic. I think that's a pretty cool thing. Can I step back though and comment on your Nike comment with Cadillac? Because that like started some wheels turning. You know how Nike manages the, I believe the Oregon Duck football team, and I'm guessing all of their collegiate sports teams. And they have like all these like custom unis that they wear throughout the season. I think it'd be pretty sweet if Nike did like got ownership of like, hey, Cadillac team, we're going to be your primary sponsor, and we're going to make like 10 different special liveries throughout the season for you that are like all custom like Nike liveries. How cool would that be? Right? Exactly. And then they could make like different shoes for them. Like, that's so cool. Like, we need to see this. Come on.
Well, and so there's like so many interesting ways that it could happen, right? Like, with, like the Ducks, for instance, Nike being like the, founders of Nike all kind of came from University of Oregon. Like it's been a long time partnership, and they make, for those that don't know, they make, all these uniforms for all the different teams. They make specific like colorways of shoes, Nikes, Jordans, running shoes, like all throughout. So like every new school year or every new sport season for the school, you end up having this influx of like, here's these like across a few months, you'll see 5 to 10 different shoes that have all these like all this Oregon branding. So you have like Jordan 3s with a duck on it or whatever that is. With the racing side of it, what's really interesting, like I'm really curious about like how that can connect to consumers, because with, let's say, the NBA, they recently in the last 5-ish, 10-ish years, started doing the sponsors on the, kind of shoulder or whatever, front chest. And like, that's always something that, as longtime fans, you never want to see it because it's like, we're just not used to it. But if you're a football fan, you've seen that, football, real football, not American football. You've seen, I don't know, I don't even have to care about football. And that Emirates is a sponsor of, like what, like that is like so part of the culture of the sport versus, American sports, we've held off on that a lot. With racing, what's interesting is, or what I would be afraid of if Nike took over, like it would have to be like a team specific thing. But then like there's so much regulation. There's so, like these guys are wearing fireproof suits. They're wearing, fireproof socks. They're wearing fireproof shoes. Like everything is very much like it's a world of its own compared to all other sports. But what doesn't happen enough in racing, and this is kind of where I get excited about all these posters behind me with Le Mans stuff, is like you have these art cars that come out for other sports. You have collaborative cars that, I think of like Kith doing, Ronnie Feig doing, M series BMW builds, and but like even like with Formula One, like it's so segmented in the brands that sponsor that are, let's say, sneaker, streetwear, apparel, fashion type brands, because like Tommy Hilfiger sponsored Mercedes throughout their relationship with Lewis, essentially, like, and then when Lewis left, like that kind of went away. But they wouldn't make a race suit necessarily. So there's like this real interesting opportunity to kind of connect these worlds that have never truly been connected. There's been moments where people try, like I have shoes called Speedwells that came out probably, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago. That was kind of like, hey, let's make racing shoes a fashion thing, and we'll make race shoes for the races too. And it's just an interesting, it's like, I feel like there's all these intersections, but in that regard, there's this giant gap that just has never happened. People have never figured it out.
Yeah, that's
and
strange,
I wonder how
right?
that, like you bringing that up, like Nike doing liveries, love or hate the basketball jerseys and the courts and all the stuff that happens in the NBA now. The idea that you could do different liveries and get people excited about it, like I think that's super cool. Like I love seeing, like Red Bull's, Japan livery a couple years ago was like absolutely beautiful. Kind of went back to almost like bar Honda days livery. With the white with the yeah. Alpine's done really cool. They've leaned more into the pink. They did the pink car a couple of times, and it was like, oh, it looks so good because you just don't see that on the track. So, which
is their BWT sponsor, which is like a water cleaning, like something kind of random. That's like what?
Yeah. But what would that look like if, for the watches side of it, or just in general, I guess, like if some brand comes in and says, hey, we're going to do like, because we see it with helmets a little bit. You get custom helmets for the races that the drivers care a little bit more about. But like, how would that look on the commercial side or consumer side of like what, people would experience if that did happen in your opinion?
Gosh, that's a good question. It's to date always been the other way around. Like I mentioned with those IWCs, and they take the Petronas colorway, or the Mosers with the Alpine, they take the BWT, like they take the other sponsors' colors and incorporate them into a watch. And just because it's not like it's such a small little bit of real estate, but there are some brands that do maybe some interesting things with straps or like stone dial type stuff. I don't know how good it would look on a car, like as a whole, but I like the idea. You mentioned the art cars, and when I think of the Coons and like the actual art cars that weren't around like selling a product, right? Like it wasn't like go buy a bunch of Jeff Koons art, like obviously, at your local store. It was about like the aesthetic of it, and I think it told like a great story. And I would love to see that kind of thing come back. You mentioned the Red Bull's Japanese livery, and I think in 2021 the Turkey livery, when they do that white livery, it's so cool. I love that kind of stuff. I was in Abu Dhabi for the final race last year, the year before that, and and one of the teams had this great like kind of striped livery. It kind of reminded me of one of those BMW cars. I like that because it encourages me to kind of look into what's going on here. Who is this? What's the story here? You maybe learn about an artist that you never knew. That does happen in watches quite a bit, where there are collaborations with artists that maybe maybe you don't know, like Hublot and Samuel Ross. Louis Rard does it with a ton of different artists. Ressence does it with artists, and it always results in something like really fascinating. And yes, it's something that you can buy, but it also puts a spotlight on this culture or that artist or something that you maybe was like totally off of your radar that that now you can appreciate in a different kind of way that you maybe never would have before. So I think in those kinds of terms, that's what it would have to take. But I miss the old kind of like obviously artistic, like kind of bombastic liveries on cars, and especially some of the endurance racers that I see behind you. Like those are all like that made the sport, where you think of, the old like Benetton cars or like it's that's ingrained in our memories of how we experienced this sport. And it is the same with how we experience a watch or a pair of sneakers. Now you look at like American football players, and they've got like Jordan 1s that have been turned into football shoes with the cleats and all that kind of stuff. So surely there could be more creativity with this kind of stuff, right? Like right now, the extent of it is like, if you look at like the gloves that they'll have on, there'll be like a printed picture of a watch on the glove to make it look like, like they're wearing. I was at an event with Richard Mille last year because they had a new Formula One watch. And at the event was Felipe Massa. And I got to chat with him briefly, and I asked him, because he was the one that got an early watch sponsor, back 20 years ago, and it was Richard Mille. And I asked, like kind of half jokingly about the engineers not letting him wear the watch while he was racing because, they go to all these lengths to save every gram and all that kind of stuff. He's like, no, I wore it racing. And I just had it on under my glove. And I couldn't believe it when he said, I was like, oh, that's so cool. And he still has all of those watches. And that's the kind of thing that that's like some serious lore now for that watch and that brand, that I wasn't really expecting, because now it all feels so controlled.
Yep. Yeah.
Way
absolutely.
too controlled.
That is like one of those, like poignant moments that'll kind of live beyond everything that we talk about, live through, experience, because I think those moments are fleeting, like we just don't have, everything becomes so controlled. Like you said, it's like, they're trying to save weight, and, it's the same thing with like the Cadillac and the Panda Dunks. Like that should have been a very calculated moment, but Cadillac probably didn't have the right contacts at Nike to start that conversation ahead of time. Or
did Nike acknowledge this at all? They didn't
I haven't
comment on
anything.
like, hey, looking good, boys, or whatever, something like this. Like, you'd think they would take advantage of it somehow.
I would have, if I was there, I would definitely encourage that. I don't know. I didn't see it, but also, admittedly, I didn't go looking through the comments on their Instagram post or anything.
Sure.
I will say that, like, in one of the pre-season videos for Cadillac F1 on their YouTube channel, you can go watch it. One of their, who's their backup driver? I'm forgetting.
Zhou Guanyu.
Zhou Guanyu. He's a big sneakerhead, and like has been for years, like been interviewed by a bunch of people to talk about sneakers. It's still, I don't think it lands in the sneaker culture world as much, but one of their kind of clips from the behind the scenes episode that they did leading up to the release of the car, they gift him a pair of Kobe's on camera, which is really cool to see. Like, obviously he's not going to wear that shoe to drive in, and I mean, I don't know if he's even a wear your shoes kind of guy, but like, sure. It was cool to see because it's at least acknowledging like something that represents him outside of, the sponsors and the track and the paddock and all the things that we know and love about racing, right? It's like, oh, this is one of those things where, I think that when you tear down the kind of facade that we all know exists, but we watch willingly and lovingly.
Yeah.
Like once you start to break that down and you get to know the guy behind the scenes, you're like, oh, that's really cool. Like, makes sense that he's a Kobe fan. Being from China, like Kobe, like, there was rumors that Kobe sold more shoes in China at times than he ever did in the US. And I don't know that that's true or anything, but like that has always been the lore behind Kobe's relationship with China, because you can go back and find photos of him touring for a shoe release or for just basketball. He used to do camps over there. And to me, it makes total sense that Zhou Guanyu would have, the connection to Kobe. Yeah, so like for whoever found that behind the scenes, it's like, oh, that's super cool. I hope that you continue to chase that kind of, forgotten thing and set up some sort of official partnership, because it would be really cool.
Yeah. Look, we need more of that kind of stuff. I like getting a glimpse of like who these guys are underneath that kind of like artificial layer that's so kind of like heavily controlled. But guys like Daniel Ricciardo, Valtteri Bottas, Max Verstappen to an extent, Kimi Räikkönen, like you get a sense of like, I bet I know what that guy's maybe like in real life, because they are just so themselves. And that makes them kind of enduring in their own ways and stuff like that. And I like that. And we've got this, last year we had this huge crop of rookies come into the sport. This year we've got another one. And I don't have really a sense of any of them. Like, what kind of people are you? I did notice on the back of Isaac Hadjar's helmet, he's got this like physics equation. And then I looked into it, and his dad is like a physics teacher. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. So he like has that to honor his dad on the back. And he's a guy that was, in Formula 2, if you paid attention to him, he was like this real bombastic, like always yelling on the mic. And, I think he's matured a bit, obviously, like you have to. And now that he's taken a step into like the main team, but I still want a little bit of that like raw Hajar-ness, and I think that'll maybe come out as he gets more comfortable and like, okay, with his place in the sport. And I also say, just in reference to all those rookies, I've been really impressed by all of them, honestly. And I think they all have like a decent future in the sport. And after one race, Arvid Lindblad also looks like pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, also just seems very level-headed with it all from what you hear on the radio. Hajar's a great example, right? Like he was very outspoken in F2. And then his first race was like probably the most humbling experience you could have. Like you messed it up, you crash out in the first 2 laps or whatever it was when you reach Formula One. And like I would never wish that upon anyone because like, it's got to be so hard to be moving towards that your entire life and then have that be your first experience. But, like you move past it and you become a better person, you become a stronger driver, you're like more prepared for the next time around. And it seems like he's kind of selective when he's, ranting on the mic with the team. But also, I don't know if that's just the way it's positioned. But, like that's what makes it interesting. Like I think, looking at like Yuki Tsunoda being like this, kind of firecracker of a personality as he's out there, and Max too, right? Like everybody's like condescending towards everybody else. That's a part of the trash talking that goes on that we don't always see a lot of. Yeah. But there's like tendency for, when Lewis came in, when Vettel came in, when Lewis came in, when Max came in, they were known as, Ricardo too, like the dive bombers, like there's just, they're going to run into you and put you in, out of a race before they'll give you an edge. Yeah. And as guys mature, they realize that it's not always about just, being the more aggressive. It's not a game of chicken, it's not diving into corners because like you're never going to finish all races if you choose that. Yeah. But there's like an element of personality that gets attached to somebody at that early time. And it usually lasts a long time. Like Lewis was like, people still talk about Lewis in that way. I don't know if Lewis is, I can't remember the last time I saw Lewis really be aggressive the way he was when he first came up. Same with Max. Max is like so much more of a refined driver now than he was, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And it used to drive me nuts, but like, knew Max was going to bring it and like it got him championships, like there's a huge value to it.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting as we get these new guys in and like where they're headed, what they, like getting to know them a little bit more beyond, I guess, that like assumption that, hey, here's a new, a rookie, he's going to be aggressive and, make a mistake, because that seems to be like the assumption for Formula One.
Yeah, right. And it's in the seasons so much longer now too. So it's kind of, you have to like play that long game a little bit different. But I mean, it's interesting because I think also the situations that the drivers find themselves in, maybe through no fault of their own. I mean, look at 2008 Brazil, how Lewis won his first championship. It was kind of, very unlikely, right? How that ended up. And I think there were people that, they hold like that makes them frustrating figures for some people, right? Who wanted their guy to win, who, whatever it is. And then they're associated with that. And I think maybe Max to some extent in 2021, obviously deserving, but, luck was on his side that day, right? And maybe a few other things were kind of like on his side that day. And then, of course, he's gone on to prove, as has Lewis, that no, he's actually legit driver. But after that 2008, Vettel won 4 in a row, so I'm sure Lewis was like, like until 2014, it's kind of like, well, what's my future going to be? Am I always just going to be this like one and done guy? And then obviously the regulation change in 2014, which is kind of like apt for maybe mentioning kind of the situation that we currently find ourselves in. This feels a little bit different than that, though. I don't know if it's going to be like a similar trajectory where it's just going to be, you better get used to Mercedes for the next
Yeah, I mean, it
half a
definitely
dozen years.
feels like we're at a big turning point for the sport. And as a fan of Formula One, like, I understand people's frustration with the hybrid systems and all of this stuff. We're one race in. If all the races come through, we've still got 20 plus to go, right? So, like, maybe we might have a few cancellations and, because of this war, but, like, I mean, I also love, the reason why I love stuff like sports car racing, IMSA, like World Endurance, is because you have those cars that are, the prototypes are all hybrid cars of some sort. Yeah. But, like, then you have the various levels of racing, and it makes it more challenging because there's guys that have exponential horsepower having to pass all these slower cars, which we didn't see much of that with this race. But the difference between the top 4 teams this year and the back of the pack seems to be pretty drastic.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what that will look like. And I think the hybrid system also, it puts more pressure on the drivers to play the game, right? Like, the last cars, they didn't have to play the game because, you hit the spot, DRS, yes or no, you're racing, right? There's more intention, there's more mental gymnastics, if you will, to have to think about, and obviously it's not just the drivers, but, like, for the whole team, right? The engineers and stuff, to think about, like, oh, well, how much power can we get out of the battery through these straights? Like, every track is going to reset the playing field no matter what, right? And I think you kind of saw it in the first part of that first race with Charles and Lewis and George Russell, right? Like, the back and forth and the, like, gamification of the electric power versus not. And that, to me, is really exciting. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, if somebody said, hey, can we just go back to the V10s? That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
Like, as a fan, like, there's a certain era where it's just like, these sound like they are jets with rubber tires on them. And that's, like, the craziest era for me in my mind. It will always be the pinnacle. It's kind of like the EV car conversation, right? It's like, do I want to have something super efficient and, I can drive around and get around easily, or do I want to drive a 6-speed manual from the 90s? Well, I always want to drive a 6-speed manual from the 90s, but if I'm just going to Costco,
yeah,
like, I still need space to carry my groceries back home. So, like, I get the back and forth that people have to play, but it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
And last thing to say is, like, I'm not a doomsdayer about it the way I've seen so many people write about it in the last week.
Yeah, it has been like that. A lot of, like, I've been really surprised by some of the reactions that I've seen. And I'm with you. And frankly, like, I, for the most part, enjoyed the race in Australia. And I think if I sat down and had no other context to any rule changes and just watched the race to enjoy it, I'd been like, oh, great. Yeah, that was fun. It seemed like the gaps could get bigger or become smaller much faster than they could with the last gen. And that feels like kind of old school F1 watching, where gaps could close quick. And, I feel like over the last, 5 years, if you see somebody build like a 4-second gap, a 5-second gap, then that was it. They're just off. And that was that. Like, now it feels like there's this much more, I don't know, maybe spontaneity to, like, how things can happen and how cars can take advantage. I mean, right now, I would say that it's probably still a little rough around the edges. And I think with a little refinement to the systems, to the software, to how things are deployed, then I think it'll get sorted. And as you mentioned, with other series like endurance racing has figured this out for a long time now, and it's still entertaining stuff to watch. And if they can figure it out over the course of, like, a 24-hour race or whatever, then, like, come on, like, we should be able to get this. I play, and I'm sure you do too, or maybe did at some point in your past, Gran Turismo.
Yeah.
And I don't play, like, a ton of video games, but the Gran Turismo has been, like, kind of a constant in my life since it, like, came out way back in the day. And so now they're on, like, Gran Turismo 7. And sometimes I'll get in some of these, within the, like, kind of past couple of generations of endurance racers on, like, Circuit Les Arts and do, like, a Le Mans run. And on the steering wheel dash, you can see the energy, like, build up in the braking and then be expended on the like, it's there, and you can get a sense of it just in that game, and it's a lot of fun for how you manage it and how you maybe different. you take a different approach to like braking on a certain corner because, you want to get that regen up. Like, I enjoy it from that perspective, but I also like if the drivers are like, look, there's an artificiality to it, to like all these passes and stuff, then I think that's just kind of like maybe some processes that need to be smoothed out for how this is actually like deployed. And if it's just like software at the end of the day, then like, come on, like, yeah, okay, maybe take like a handful of races the first half of the season and just kind of like figure that out, maybe make some changes at every race, fine. But I think part of the interesting thing with Formula One is that every track presents a different challenge to the teams. And some cars are going to like, and drivers and teams will handle some tracks better and handle some tracks worse. And that's kind of like what makes the sport unique,
Yeah.
I don't follow golf. I'm not a golfer, but I imagine it's the same with that. Like some courses are better suited to some people's games. Whereas like football, either American or European, it's, the same regulation set of, all that kind of stuff. The track is just another one of the characters in this. And I like that. So to me, like there should be a challenge here to figure out with the teams. And of course, I think a lot of the complaining just comes down to teams. Some teams like are just getting outplayed by it, right?
Totally.
For how they approach to it. And that's always been F1. So to me, this is just like kind of standard stuff. Of course, Mercedes is like, tough shit, we got it. And if, Ferrari on the starts, we got it right. So, don't come in here and just ask everything to change. But it's like, that's how F1 has always been.
Yep,
so
totally.
It's not surprising to see,
Yep. Yeah. And I think, like as a Honda fan, it sucks to see thinking that Newey was going to, be the, I'm a Fernando Alonso fan, like it's not a lifelong fandom. I'd say like he, I think he's a character and like he's entertaining and like, obviously he's one of the more calculated drivers out there. So it's just somebody that I always kind of want to see successful. So like seeing him back partnered with Honda is a little nostalgic and like, there's like this like kind of
not in a good way for him.
Yeah, not for him, but for as a fan, right? It's like, oh, this connected two things for me. And I think that's a part of the sport that's always really interesting. But then seeing, Adrian Newey being the guy when it comes to Formula One car design and then having them struggle is like very interesting, So I know there's a lot of people that are definitely feeling types of ways about a lot of that stuff. One thing I was going to say about Gran Turismo, I can't remember, this is probably like 15 or 20 years ago now, but for one of my brother's birthdays, we actually ran the 24-hour Le Mans on Gran Turismo, like played the whole 24 hours for his birthday. He was like, oh, let's get a bunch of friends together. So we had 4 or 5 of us that like hopped in and, like it was a crazy fun experience. Back then, like there was no, like we didn't think about any of the things. It was so limited to where the game has gotten to today, which is, now I was thinking, we were just talking about it a few weeks back. I was like, we should probably try to do that again just because it's changed so much and the experience is so much more realistic that it'd be cool to go back to that. But
yeah, absolutely. It's so much fun.
Yeah. So we're about at time, but I want to ask, for the season looking ahead, what are your thoughts on 2 things? The watch side of it. If somebody's listening to this, it's never really paid attention to watches or has a very small understanding of that world. What can they look for when they're watching Formula One? And then obviously I got to know who your teams are, who you're rooting for. What are your predictions for the season?
I'm the I hope everybody has fun kind of guy. No, look, like I've always liked Lewis. So especially as his career's gone on and the kind of weird twists and turns it has taken, I hope that he seems to be in a much better place this season so far. Obviously coming out of China last season, I'd have said the same thing, but you can see how that went. So I hope to see in the Ferrari, like I like the Ferrari car. I like Charles, so I wouldn't mind seeing them do well. I also really like Kimi Antonelli. Like he seems like a sweet kid, like a really genuine kid, and he seems like a real kind of like raw talent. So if we end up getting a lot of like close battles between Mercedes and Ferrari, like I'd be a pretty happy guy. That's kind of where I'm at there. And I like the cars look a little smaller, a little more agile. Like I'm excited about this season. I really am. Even if I'm also kind of in the camp of like, throw an old naturally aspirated V8 or V10 in there, great. But, those days may be behind us. As far as the watch side of things, I think a lot of watch brands, again, are still kind of like figuring out how to do this in a way that's unique, that gets them attention. You will notice that somebody, the three winners, if they've got a watch sponsor, somebody their handlers will come up and put a watch on the podium, on the little stand there that they've got their water on. So you'll see what watches that they put on. And it usually sometimes will revolve around a new release from a brand. For a while, obviously, we saw Max Verstappen winning a lot, and Tag Heuer has been a sponsor of the Red Bull team for a long time, and now they're kind of a sponsor of the sport as a whole, because they're part of LVMH Group, who took over that kind of title sponsor role from Rolex, who had it prior. So I think we'll see some fun stuff from Tag Heuer this year. They have been in the habit of releasing a new Monaco watch called the Monaco at the Monaco race. I would expect maybe something similar this year to come from them, but they also do these old school kind of Formula One watches that were from the 90s. If you were into watches in the 90s, you will recognize the look of the clock above the pit lane as they exit onto the track. It looks like the dial of those old school F1. Those are actual in watches now that you can buy, again, that look about just like the ones from the 90s. Maybe a little more expensive than those ones, but still not like super, super expensive in terms of like watches, at least. They're maybe $1,500 or something. So expensive, but not like a couple $100 cheap, which is kind of a bummer. Breitling is making their first appearance in the sport formally alongside the aforementioned Aston Martin. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Because of where the team is now, they kind of just naturally will get a lot of attention, and people are always looking at the car because it's a newie car. So even if it's bad, I think you'll still get a lot of visibility. I would expect them to release some new watches around this season. They already released a titanium Navitimer, which is the first for the Navitimer coming into the season. IWC, of course, is still doing interesting things with the Mercedes team. They released a pair of George Russell watches coming into the season that, again, take advantage of the Patronus green colorway. Moser is always doing really cool things. They just released a mechanical watch for the drivers and a digital watch for the mechanics with these pink straps. So there's all kinds of like cool things. And I will say one other thing, Tudor, who is a sponsor of Visa Cash App Racing Bulls, again this year, this is their 100th anniversary. Tudor. So I think we'll see a lot of really interesting things from them this year as a whole. And we are, as I sit here, maybe a month away from the biggest event in the watch world called Watches and Wonders that happens in Geneva. And that is where we will see most of the new releases for the season actually released. So if you're into this kind of thing, or if your watches are interesting to you at all, definitely pay attention to that in mid-April.
And also find Blake the Deep Track.
Yeah, I didn't want to be that on the nose, but if you really, there are plenty of great outlets that you can go find this stuff on. But yes, I also write about this stuff. I'll be in Geneva for the show and covering it live, so you can follow on Instagram at the Deep Track and thedeeptrack.com, the Deep Track podcast, all that kind of stuff. And whenever I get the excuse to, I always talk about F1 and racing and stuff like that as well. So if you're also into that kind of stuff, you can keep an eye out for that as well.
Man, well, it was great to catch up with you. Great to talk about this stuff. I feel like we could probably go for a few more hours, but I know we've both got things going on today, so we'll have to pause that and come back to it. But a lot of cool ideas coming from this conversation too. So thanks everybody for watching, listening, tuning in. Leave us a review if you haven't. We're trying to really kind of get this thing jump started again. We haven't done shows regularly for quite a while, but we're going to have some fun with it this year, this season, and hopefully get to talk about some other racing and get a little bit deeper into Formula One at the same time. We appreciate y'all. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.